Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Peter Hill.
Thank you, Russ. Make sure they've got a seat behind it. Thank you, good evening, and thank you for having me. It's always interesting when an Englishman stands up to talk about the Scottish National Bard, and you wonder what on earth is coming. And you're not alone, because I do as well, but I looked at the back of the programme, and there's some pretty esteemed company in there that, you know, some present tonight, past presidents, etc. And then to my horror, I realised that my father-in-law's name's on there, along with my wife's uncle's name on there. And if you're looking down, guys, give one for me. So, 1759, you always get these dates on the Immortal memory. 1759. And as you'd heard, we spoke about the Greenloaning Burns Club. And it's quite interesting when you put the date 1759 in front of the Greenloaning Burns Club committee and you say, what does that date actually mean to you? And you would expect a pretty profound response. What we actually got was that was the year that Arthur Guinness put down a 9,000-year lease at St James's Gate in Dublin for the Guinness Brewery. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. So, yeah, we're going to talk about, obviously, Robert Burns, and I got a bit of a steer from Russ in the first instance, and I said, so, you know, what do you want me to do? And he said, well, he said, Peter, he said, I've known you for a while. He said, you can do what you like. He said, just keep it clean. So, I've tried my best, and I've got it sort of moving on time and getting it nice and clean, so that should do the job. Right, seatbelts on, and let's see where we're going with this. It's always interesting as well when Burns is mentioned that the comparison starts between England and Scotland. And so that seems like a pretty good place to start for me as well. So let's have a look at some great literature writers from England and a few from Scotland. So we've got Geoffrey Chaucer, we've got Ashmole, we've got William Wordsworth, a couple of Scots, we've got Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, we've got Daniel Defoe, and we've obviously got Robert Burns. And all of them were in the employ of His Majesty's Customs or Excise. But only one is remembered as the poet and excise man. And that's who we're here to celebrate tonight. And it means an awful lot to His Majesty's Revenue Service, that was the case. Chaucer was a customs controller actually in London. Ashmole was an excise collector in Lichfield. Wordsworth was actually a distributor of stamp duties in Westmoreland. Adam Smith, in Wealth of Nations, as I mentioned before, he was actually a customs controller in Edinburgh. And Daniel Defoe was an excise commissioner for glass in Edinburgh as well. And for the last 7 years of Burns's life, between 1789 and 1796, he was in the employ of the Scottish Excise Service. He had duties to perform, he had books to balance, he had accounts to reconcile, he had poems to write, Tam O'Shanter being one of them during that period. He had songs, literature, 595 of these things came out during his lifetime. And indeed, he had the lassies. And when I was doing the research for this, I'm indebted to the lads at the National Maritime Museum in Liverpool, and we were down in the depths of this thing, and I'll never forget, it's one of the funniest moments when you're wading through all of this parchment and everything else, and we were talking about the lassies, and one of the guys holds up this piece of parchment, and he said, hey, he was a bit of a lad there with the lassies, wasn't he? And I thought, if ever there was an understatement from a Liverpudlian, that has got to be it. And so that was the situation. What I want to do is, I basically want to talk to you about how this all fits in, because Robert Burns was a pretty unlikely gauger in terms of the excise service. He had revolutionary tendencies, which we know about. He was a nationalist, he was at odds with the George III government. He actually campaigned tirelessly, and his literature tells you this, for the poor over power. And also, he had a love of Scotland's national drink. So he was not necessarily the right guy to go into the service. So what we're going to do is, over the next few minutes, is literally just have a look at the service itself and taxation, where that comes from, how Burns actually joined, which is not just a case of going on LinkedIn, right? And a day in the life. And we're going to actually bring that to life in Dunblane as well for you as well. So I'm going to take you back to 1643 when the Dutch had a tax for homegrown duties, excise duties, and it was called the assize. And that was then brought over to our shores in 1643, and it was primarily designed to raise money for parliamentary activity against Charles I. And it was an incremental taxation system, which basically meant it came in 1, 3, 5 and 10 years' time, with a little bit more getting added on each occasion. And we've seen this picture before, because it happens all the time. Okay, so in the first year it was ales, it was spirits, and it was cider. Added to in the third year, we have salt, we have paper, we have also in there we have fish as well, and we also on year 5 we started to get starch, glass and linen added to it, and then in year 10 we had leather, we had hats and we had candles, all being taxed, all homegrown goods. And you can tell from that list, that hit the pocket of the poor. This didn't get the gentry, this got the poor. And that started to, should we say, hack people off. They didn't like it. And the excise man became the most despised man in the nation. Not only for that reason, the excise man had the power, and the only one that had the power, of entry and search. And incidentally, to this day, there are only 8 excise people in the United Kingdom, all with that power. They can enter your home without a search warrant. They have a card to do it, and if it's a police officer that's got an excise officer with them as well, they're in. They don't need a search warrant. Still to this day. And it's interesting, because back in the day, they hated that. They were trying to brew stuff. They were trying to make stuff under the table, under the counter. And you didn't want, if somebody was going to come into your house, you wanted a bit of notice so you could hide it. But you couldn't in this particular situation. And in this case, I just want to have a look at the alcohol side of this, because you had 2 sets of brewers. Basically, you had the ale houses, which was like Younger's in Edinburgh. Incidentally, William Younger, the wee man that we actually see there, his brewery? No, it was his wife's brewery. It could not have been William Younger's brewery, because William Younger was a customs superintendent, and it was a conflict of interest. So Heineken will actually tell you when you go in it was him, but if you look at the excise record, you will see that it was registered to his wife. So behind every great man there's a woman. There's your story there. So in 1650, the taxman, as such, entered the English lexicon for the very first time. And it entered because of the tenant farmers, which were away from the big brewers. These were the farms and the outlands, and they used to brew to actually supplement their income. And because farmers were busy, they were out in the fields, they didn't have John Deeres or anything like this going out there doing it for them. They were busy, so they needed to actually have somebody on site that would collect the money, the assizes, the excise money for them, the duties. So the young lads that were in the stable that used to tack up the horses, they had nothing to do once they'd done that and cleared the stables out. So they used to go round the tenant farms and collect the duties. And that's when the word taxman, which originally was T-A-C-K-S, as opposed to T-A-X, come into the English language. Now, just to let you know the size of the problem at that point in time, in 1777, within a 15-mile radius of the Glenlivet distillery in Scotland, there were 200 illicit stills seized and destroyed. Within the square mile around the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, there were 450 illicit stills seized and destroyed. In fact, it was such a plague that in 1780, the excise service really clamped down on it. And in Scotland alone, it holds the record for this, 6,000 stills were seized and destroyed, beating England by some good number. Wales didn't even compare, and neither did Northern Ireland. So there you go. There's a nice first up there. So it turns out that it was a pretty poor job that he had from Burns' point of view. His salary when he first joined the excise service, £50 per annum. As I mentioned before, there's only 8 excise people in the UK now. In actual fact, there's 7 because there's a vacancy. That vacancy is in South Wales at the moment. And the starting pay for that is £26,000 to £35,000 per annum. And it states in it that it's 42 hours a week, and Monday to Friday might be required to work nights and some weekends. And I just wonder if you put those terms and conditions under Burns's nose back in the day, what he would have done with them. Like, I'm up for that. You can see it happening. It's the way it works. So that's basically where the system came from. Let's have a look at how it works from there on in. Now, interesting thing. In England, it was very much a treasury appointment. So if you wanted to get into the excise service, you needed to know somebody that was in the treasury. They would actually do it for you. However, you could get in through Freemasonry. There was a bit of that going on. There was a bit of nepotism going on as well. But you could also get in if any of your family members were actually involved in any of these following activities. If there were merchants, if there were brewers, if there were farmers, if there were tradesmen, and in fact, any of your family members were that, it would give you the door into the service. So Findlater and Stobie, which were two of Burns's supervisors, their fathers were both in the excise service, and that's how they got in. So you could get it through that way as well. Now the hierarchy within His Majesty's Excise Service, and it still is the same as that now, you had the officer, which was Burns's rank, then you had the supervisor, then you had the collector, and then you had the commissioner. And when Burns was due to move to Dunblane, he was already took the promotion from the officer, and he was acting supervisor at that particular point in time. This came as a permanent post. Talk a little bit more about that in a moment. What is it that you needed to have to actually get in then? So, a couple of things. You needed a patron. And in this particular case, the patron that he had two of them. Not many people had that, but he had two. One was Robert Graham, the 12th Earl of Fintry, and he met him on the 3rd of August, 1787. These dates now start to bear some significance, so we'll come back to these. And he met him at Blair Athol, so it was on the way on one of his tours. He also had James Cunningham, who was the 14th Earl of Glencairn. Now, Cunningham was a useful man to have because Cunningham bought one of the first editions of the Kilmarnock edition. The following year, he actually bought 100 copies of the Edinburgh edition. So he was very firmly in his camp. What you also needed was you needed an examination, which we would now call an interview, by a supervisor. And it's believed that the supervisor was Robert Nimmo. You can't quite tell that from the parchment itself because it's blurred. What you can tell is the date that it was the 4th of December 1787. And it was actually signed in Allison Square in Edinburgh. So you can still make the address out, you can make the date out, but you can't make the signature of the supervisor out. It's believed to be Robert Nimmo because Robert Nimmo was actually at a party that day at that address, as was Robert Burns. And we know that Robert Burns met Agnes McElhose, which we know there as Florinda, at that party. So that's where the signature actually comes in. What he also needed was he needed a certificate of entry. So he's got three things that he needed to get so far. His certificate of entry was actually signed in January 1788. So we're now out of 87 and we're now into 88. And that was signed by Robert Graham. Now, interestingly enough, it was signed only after Graham received a letter. And the letter was begging for forgiveness. And I know we're indebted to somebody that's done an awful lot of research in this hall tonight, David Sibbald, over to my left over here, because the letter was begging for forgiveness for the etching on the window of Wingate's Inn, which we know better as the Golden Lion, which is where the Stirling burnt supper hold their burnt supper. So if you're looking for somewhere to go to continue the tradition, get in touch with that man over there. And that was in August 1787. The last bit of the puzzle was that Sir John Whiteford actually was the master of the lodge at Tarbolton, where Burns was at. And the advice that he gave to Burns was, if you want to join the excise service, buy a farm. And interestingly enough, in 1788, he bought Ellisland. So he then became one of those farmers, merchants, etc. And that's pretty much how that worked. Now, he wrote to Glencairn again in 1788 for support, and 2 weeks later, on the 14th of February 1788, he actually wrote to Margaret Chalmers, and in that he proposed as well, got the knockback, no surprises there. I've entered into the excise service and will be in the West for 3 weeks, and then in Edinburgh for 6 weeks for instruction. And that was what we would call an induction period now, which is 6 weeks induction. It's still 6 weeks induction in the excise service. So that's the situation. Now what we're going to do is have a quick look at that timeline. 1788, February 1788, because you think now that he's basically said to Margaret that I'm in, he's got the job, meaning it only took 6 months. Wrong. Far from it, as you're about to see. March the 31st, he got an order for instruction from James Finlay, and the instruction started on the 14th of April, halfway through April. His instruction certificate was actually signed off on the 31st of May, so he did it in 6 weeks. Not because he scrimped, not because he cut corners, but because he put a shift in, as they said down in Liverpool that day. On the 14th of July, it was signed. Interestingly enough, that commission of Burns going in to the excise service that was signed has been sold twice in semi-recent history. The first one was in 1854, where it was sold for £5.12. And the second one was in 1923, where it was sold for £550. I have no idea what that commission would actually fetch if it went to auction now, but it would be certainly more than that. In August 1788, that's nearly a year on from when he first met Graham up at Blair Athol, Burns wrote to Graham asking, it's a bit sneaky actually, but he wrote to Graham asking that a guy called Leonard Smith, who was the collector in Dumfries, to actually see if he could get him shifted. Now, of course that's fine, but Graham didn't have any authority, so he couldn't do that. But what he could do was he could actually introduce him to the person that carried the can, as far as that was concerned. And interestingly enough, there's a big gap in the documentation. It's not because of the fire that happened in the excise in 66, and it's not because of the fire that happened in 83 either. But there is a big gap in the activities that happens here, because Graham introduced Burns to John Mitchell in May 1789. Remember this started in 1787? We're now in 1789, so we're now nearly a year and a half in that Burns is searching for this job, okay? And on July the 31st, 1789, Burns was ordered to buy the equipment of what's referred to as a brewer's rule, which is a gauging rod, which you drop down into the barrels. And he actually joined the excise service on the first week of September 1789. I'll just take you back to when he met Graham, back in August 1787. So that's 2 years to try and get into that job for £50 a year. Interesting, really interesting. He had to buy a lot of equipment. It was all his own, right? The excise did not treat their people well. He had to buy a gauging stick. He had to buy a sliding rule, which allowed you to actually dip into the deeper barrels. A slide rule for working out the angles when you were measuring the barrels. A wax seal. Also a box and tape. We'll tell you more about those in a moment. A brass plate and a float, so as you could see what the specific gravity was. A lot of these tools were actually designed by excise people. An excise guide, of which there were 8 volumes that he had to buy. It's not a case, you know, you can get these off of Amazon back in the day. You know what I mean? You had to go and get these from the printers. The Digest of Excise Laws, right, which was released every year, came in 4 volumes. It still does. It's electronic now, but he also needed keys, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, in actual fact, Burns' first ride, the one that Russ referred to that I did, is actually around the 10 parishes, is 179 miles. And he had to do that on horseback. Right? Now, interestingly enough, in February 1790, remember he joined in September, the year before, in February 1790, Jenny Geddes, his mare, that he bought for £5 in Edinburgh, died. So that prompted him to then write again to see if he could get, instead of the outright, to see if he could actually get a footwalk in Dumfries. And he got that on the 25th of July. So in actual fact, his first ride, he was only doing that between September, when he joined, and between July the following year. So there's only 8 or 9 months he was actually doing it. But what he had to do during those 8 or 9 months would cripple most people, to be perfectly honest with you. That outride in Dumfries, according to the excise records, had 2 tanners, 11 maltsters, 2 victuallers, 3 wine dealers, 21 spirit dealers, 27 tobacconists, 15 tea dealers, 2 compounders. Now, compounders are the farms that I talked about before, by brewers, and they would actually brew what we call small beer. And the big beer is actually done by youngers and tenants and so on and so forth. But small beer was sold for 2pence a pint. And that's where the line with Tipney comes from, that we'll hear a little bit later on in Tam O'Shanter. Now, interestingly enough, if we compare that to literally the year 1818 in this very town, the biggest industry, because we know Burns was going to move here, right? So this is what he would have had to have looked after as a supervisor. The biggest industry in Dunblane at that particular time was handloom weaving. And registered on the excise records, there were 700 hand weavers in Dunblane. Right? Now, Dunblane was a pretty big place at that particular point in time, because according to the statistical account of 1793, it had, believe it or not, 41 houses of ale and spirits. Right? Now, Dunblane also took in Greenloaning, it took in Sheriffmuir, it took in Kimbuck, and it took in Ashfield. Now, of those 41 houses, 29 of them were in this town. 29 pubs existed in this town. It was a huge problem, alcoholism. And children were out on the streets, parents were actually drunk, and literally the subordinate sheriff placed an order to literally remove some of those. And by 1831, that was reduced to 22. So from the 41, it was reduced to 22. The people that actually did most of the closing down was the excise officers. So that's what Burns would have had to deal with had he have come here. Interestingly enough, one of the things that he had to do, any excise officer back in the day, they had to literally do what we call sittings. Right? Now, in the situation of sittings, 8 sittings per year, there was one every 6 weeks. And a sitting basically is where all of the people that you'd actually given tax invoices to, for want of a better expression, would actually come and pay their bills. All right? And they were done in local alehouses. And lots of the landlords would actually try and vie for the business, because you can imagine, you've literally got a captive audience. You've got people coming to pay their bills, and while they're there, oh, we'll have a drink. So the takings would go up in the alehouses. Now, according to excise records, there were actually 4, but there's only 3 listed. 3 were registered on at least one occasion as sittings in Dunblane. On the north of the town, I'm calling it a town because as it was then, but on the north of the town was the Sun Tavern, which would later change its name to the Inn at White Cross. We now see a wee shop just sitting on that corner. Right? So that's the first thing. The second one was the Head Inn, which was later called the Sterling Arms, and now the Riverside. So that was used for it. And in the central part of the town, these were the 2 taverns. One was called Rob Roy's Cave, and that is what we now see as the Cathedral Cottages. And right next to it, adjacent was an adjacent tavern for Overspill. It never named it, it just said that. So it wasn't a main one, it's just if the business was booming for them, that's where they would put them. So what did they do there? Basically, this was it. This is what Burns had to do on his day-to-day things. I mentioned earlier that he had keys, right? And it was a common call that actually the excise man would have more keys than the jailer had, right? Because that's the way it worked. Their job, remember I said he had 179 miles in his patch. Their job, basically, was to ride out to various merchants, manufacturers, etc., and unlock the tool chests, because they weren't allowed to make things at night, where they could actually then pop all the stuff away and sell them without paying excise duty. So he rode out in the morning, unlocked the tool chests, or the storage rooms, depending on which they saw fit, and those storage rooms would be taped and waxed, that's where it came from in the inventory, and basically he would then have to ride back at the end of the day and do a reconcile inventory, look at what had been manufactured and look at what had actually been used out of the inventory to see whether it matched up, in case anything had gone missing. Right? Now, once they'd done that, they then issued a voucher, and that was the excise duty that was due on that particular item. Those vouchers were then taken to the sittings, along with the amount of money that was required, and then what you would do is literally just pay the excise man, go and have a jar, possibly get drunk. And if you really wanted an image of what one of these sittings actually looked like, pass by an ingle breezing finely. If you can imagine that picture, that's exactly what a sitting looks like. There are pictures drawn of that kind of thing, as well as obviously the illustration you see at Tam O'Shanter. So that's a day in his life. You know, you don't have to do that. Ride out, 179 miles to cover. There was only 2 other officers that he was with, Penn and Rankin. That was the only 2 other officers that he had. And incidentally, keep in mind that up until the 25th of August, in 1791, he was still farming at Ellisland as well. So he was a pretty industrious character. Ellisland was sold in 1791 in August, and it was sold for £1 an acre. Any farmers in here will think, really? Show me those prices again. And that's what it was sold for. That would go for a different price now. But I'm going to leave you with a little bit of swashbuckling, and this is the only bit that actually comes into the swashbuckling side of things. And it relates to an incident on the 27th of February 1792. And by this particular point in time, remember that Burns was in Dumfries. He got his foot walk, so he was away from the town. And you would get called in to do work. And in this particular case, there was a schooner called the Rosamond of Plymouth. And the Rosamond was actually sitting in the Solway Firth. It was about a mile out. And it was known for contraband, and they were after it. And Penn, Rankin and Burns, under the command of Burns, actually went out to get it, and they had 40 horse-mounted dragoon guards with them as well. Now the first thing is they tried to catch them while the tide was in, and they needed boats. But of course the locals were wise to what was going on, so they hid the boats. Lovely people, right? So they waited until the tide went down. They couldn't go out on horseback, so it was a foot charge. And we were lucky that we actually got Burns for the last 4 years when you hear about this. There were 3 parties that raided it. One to the fore, that's the sharp end of the boat. One to the aft, that's the blunt end of the boat. And the others, which were led by Burns, was on the broadside. And they faced cannon fire, they faced pistol shots, and throughout the fire that they were under, they charged until the crew broke ground on the English side and ran. We've heard that story before somewhere else as well, I think. But basically, what they did before they left was they put a 6-pounder cannonade through the boat, thus rendering it useless. Now, it was Burns' job as the senior officer to actually get the ship shape, sell it at an auction, and then turn the money into the excise. So he did, right? He actually paid for the fishermen, the carpenters and the dragoons to guard the boat while it was being repaired. That was £17.10. The cost of the full repairs was £45.15 and 4pence. Some of your parents will tell you about this, but I actually remember this currency, you know. The ship and the contents were sold at auction for £166, 66 shillings and 6pence. It's not easy to say after a few tramps, I can tell you. And Burns paid all of that, and the money then went to the excise. And Burns then got his reward for it. £2. £2, 12 pund Scots. That line also crops up somewhere else, I think. So, you know, he was a pretty industrious character. There's no doubt about that. And I have to say that in 2006 there was an exhibition in the Maritime Museum by Customs and Revenue, which it now is, and they put it out. I'm not proud of this particular issue, but I'm proud of what the guys actually did. But they put the whole display out of the excise service, and Robert Burns wasn't in it. And the lads in the museum at Liverpool refused to man that exhibition until Burns was put in it. And they put Burns right in the centre, and then right underneath it was a can of Carlsberg. That's the closest you're going to get in Liverpool. And it's really interesting. It has to be, from my point of view, I mean, I love the guy, I love his poetry, I love his work, and you know, what he stood for, and how he actually stood for it. But I have to say, of all of the people I've researched, he's probably one of the most industrious people that I have ever had the pleasure to do. And what I would ask you to do is to be upstanding and raise your glass. To the industrious, ordinary